Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. Today we are back looking at the suggestions past the developers in December of 2018. Now we've already had a look through the ground forces, we've had a look through the airplanes, now it's time for the helicopters and also the naval stuff. Now I apologize for this video being a bit late, I'm unfortunately quite ill at the moment. Anyway, let's get started. So looking at the naval stuff and the helicopters, the reason why I'm doing them together is because there was only a total of 7 projects which were pushed forward for these two branches of War Thunder. Therefore, I'm going to go over them in one video, and then the other video will focus on all of this stuff, which will be like, maybe classes like miscellaneous or gameplay, I think would be a better one. So anyway, let's get started with another American light cruiser, with the addition of the other light cruiser to the American tree in the last update, along with every nation now which has a naval tech tree has 2 light cruisers. Why not have a look at some other light cruisers that could be added to the game? So, the Atlanta class light cruiser comes along for the Americans. Now, what is interesting about this light cruiser? Well, from reading this article from Rogue Star Flyer, the main thing that seems to be the ideas behind the Atlanta class was that they wanted a faster cruiser which could deal with an air threat, which could also be used for scouting. Now, it's kind of funny to me thinking about a light cruiser being a scout, but when you actually think about, the size of some other of the ships running around the place, it kind of makes sense. It was also supposed to be the leader of specific, as it says, leading destroyer flotilla leaders, and the reason for this is so, once again, it could scout and also offer a lot of anti-air support. So, some Atlanta cruisers, Atlanta class light cruisers, 4 of them were authorized during the pre-World War II build program, and they were supposed to be armed with 8 dual 5-inch gun turrets, which had the firepower of 3 destroyers. So even though this thing was designed to be fast, was designed to be a scout, was designed to be focused around anti-air, it still had the firepower of 3 destroyers, showing how in-game this thing will still have a lot of firepower behind it, even if it is focused in other areas. On top of this, it was supposed to replace the Omaha class of light cruisers, which were from the 1920s, so this would be a direct upgrade from them, and of course they would perform certain types of cruiser duty. As I said before, the idea of fast scouting, the idea of some anti-aircraft support, these were the main ideas which came around when we have a look at the Atlanta class. Now, after the war, the remaining Atlanta and Oakland class cruisers, they were quickly decommissioned, and this was largely due to the number of problems that had occurred with them throughout the war. Now, the reason why I'm not really going through them or the problems that they had, is because in-game, these will not be factors. Just like how, we won't have engine troubles on specific ground vehicles. We won't have specific planes deciding to blow up in the middle of the air. Yes, I'm looking at you, VB. So, there's these factors that are not really required to look at when we think about War Thunder, but if you do want to look at the history of the Atlanta class in its fullest, I would definitely say do so, because it is always interesting looking into these larger ships, or at least larger ships in the context of War Thunder. So, also, this article is wonderful because it gives examples of what we could see in the game. So it doesn't just say, Atlanta class light cruiser, it gives some stuff for us to have a dig into. So the USS San Diego, this was the second US Navy ship to bear the California City name, and it was a light anti-aircraft cruiser. It was commissioned in 1942 and played a part in almost every Pacific campaign during World War II. So this is a seasoned machine along with its crew. 34 major battles, 18 battle stars, and it was more than any other United States ship except for the famous USS Enterprise, and it traveled 300,000 miles. Very, very crazy indeed. Now, what is interesting is if they decide to add this in, always the stuff that we're looking at is generally speed, generally armor, and also generally its weaponry. These seem to be the main three factors when it comes to War Thunder when we have a look at any machine in any part of the game. Now, since these machines were supposed to be faster, what I'm gathering is that their armor was also lighter than other light cruisers which were around at the time. So if we have a look at the armament of it, in 1942, you have 16 5-inch guns, which are set up in 8 dual sets. Then you have 16 1.1 inches set in 4 sets of quadruples, and then 8 single 20mm Oerlikons, 8 torpedo tubes, 6 depth charge projectors, and 2 depth charge tracks. Then in 1945, obviously they decided to upgrade it. They had 16 5-inches, so once again, 8 sets of dual mounts, so that didn't change. You had 4 quad 40mm of the Bofors anti-aircraft cannons, so obviously that's increased. And then you have 13 20mm Oerlikon anti-aircraft cannons, 8 21 inches, 6 depth charge projectors, and once again 2 depth charge tracks. So the thing that was really a big difference between the 42 and the 45 was the loss of the 16 1.1-inch anti-aircraft guns, replaced with 4 quad 40mm Bofors. Now, I think that is a drastic improvement if we're looking at a machine which is supposed to be anti-aircraft, and also it has enough firepower on it to deal with pretty much anything that it would face on the battlefield. The armor, though, as you can see, the belt is 95mm. This is still quite I would say average at least for the game. So generally, it would still be pretty well armored, but it wouldn't be as well armored as some of the other machines that we have, such as the Dido, such as the Krasnys. The main thing, though, is looking at the general X-ray of it. It doesn't have the same ability as something like the Kern, or however you say it, where it doesn't have like the fuel tanks which are covering everything, which means that it has that extra layer of survivability for its main components, and obviously you just get set on fire a lot in stuff like the Kern. So yeah, I mean, it could also go 32.5 knots, so 60 kilometers an hour. This is definitely not a slow machine. And of course, 796 officers and also enlisted, a decent amount of crew as well. I would love to see this in the game if we're going to go forward with larger ships, which is something that BVVD talked about. I think this would be a great addition to the American line as long as it came along with other nations' similar vehicles. Then we have a barge. So this is the Marine Farm Pram. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. I apologize. The F441 AT441. This is from Lord of Sofa, a wonderful name. And this was laid down in 1941 as the F441. And then in 1942, it was converted into an artillery barge, or the German equivalent of the word, which I am not going to try and say. And the designation was changed to the AT441, and then later the AF26. Now, Lord of Sofa believes that this should be a premium version of the artillery barges that we have in the game. We already have, some of the artillery barges in the game, and I feel like, yeah, I mean, I personally have enjoyed them quite a lot. The main thing that I've enjoyed about them is their sluggish nature, and the fact that they have really good firepower for their BR, so you can kind of tear up anything you go up against, but they're definitely balanced because, well, it's very easy to hit them with torpedoes. Even with, full engine upgrades and everything like that, they still get in the way, they're still large, it's still easy to hit them with torpedoes. So for me, you have like a really good side of it, which is the firepower, but then it has issues in the form of its maneuverability. Now this one here, in 1944, it provided cover for ships around Norway, which is generally where you find most of these barges, if not all of these barges, in the north around the Scandinavian areas. And then it was also used in 1944 for Operation Tan Ost, and it took light damage, and then it went to Windau for repairs, and then it was bombed, which is an unfortunate end to a lot of ships of the German Navy. So, on top of this, if we actually look at the general armament of this machine, what it has is a quad 20 on the front, then it has two 88mm guns here and here. So for me, I think this would be a good complement for some form of premium. It also has a decent amount of armor on it. So the armor of the steel plates, 100mm, and then, it has the steel plates, and then between them 100mm of concrete, and the engine room was surrounded by 20mm of WH. So additionally, the hull was covered with armored plates out of WH with up to 40mm of thickness. So this thing is pretty well armored, which, the battle barges generally are. But the firepower on it, I believe, for a premium is good. But for a standard tech tree vehicle, the question is, would you want to go for something like this, or maybe something like the S100, or the 38, or would you want to go for the other barges, because even though you might be a little bit slower, you would have more armaments. It's kind of like which would you prefer, a little bit more maneuverability or more armaments? And I think a lot of people would go for the more armaments, but because of that choice, I like this idea of it being a premium, because it's very close to its standard tech tree counterpart. We already have that tech tree counterpart in the game in the form of the other barges in the German tree, and also it doesn't have anything crazy to it, so it's not like paying for power. Another thing which is nice about this article is that it shows a bunch of interesting pictures, and that's one of the nicest things about looking through these suggestions, seeing the pictures that people can find of these machines. The next one is another light cruiser from the Soviets this time. This is the Project 68K. It's done by Wolfpack, and this is a late 1930s design, which didn't really get off the ground until the 1950s. What I mean by this is in Leningrad CBD-17, they were given the task of developing a new type of light cruiser. The general ideas for it was that they wanted something which had 4 sets of triple 152mm guns and armor, which had a general increase over the previous project, which was the Project 26 bis. So they wanted, even though the guns themselves are smaller caliber, because the idea started off with 3 triple sets of 180s, what you get from the 68K is 4 sets of triple 152. So overall you get more firepower, and then you also get a bit more armor compared to its compatriot. So the actual technical work, so we're talking about the design here, the design of it was approved in 1939, and the first cruiser, the Chapayev, it was being laid down on the August 10th of 1939, so pretty quick. But the Chapayev, it had a planned completion date, I'm sure is what Wolfpack is supposed to say, in mid-1942. So we're talking about a project which would take about 2.5 years to create the first one. This is, to be quite honest, not too bad, especially with, if you look at the Soviets at the time, where they weren't putting a huge effort into their naval side compared to the others. Now, obviously, during 1939 and 1942, guess what happened? Operation Barbarossa turned up, and the Germans decided to invade the Soviets, or the USSR, I should say. So therefore, a lot of the funds and a lot of the materials which were there for the Soviet Navy were transferred to the Air Force and the Ground Force, because these were seen as much more important at the time. So the Chapayev, which at this point had been, it had a planned completion date of 1942, it actually only became fully completed and saw service in 1950. So a full 8 years after it was supposed to be completed and ready for service. And it only had a really short service life, only 8 years, and in 1958 it was removed from naval service and used as a training cruiser. They only made 5 of the originally planned 17 ships, and by 1964 the majority were either scrapped or partially scrapped. So overall, it was meant for the war effort. It didn't have a huge impact, but from a War Thunder point of view, this does seem to be a nice addition to the light cruisers that could be added to the game. So, what does this actually have on it? It has, as I said, the 152mm. It has them in sets of 3. So you have 4 sets of 3, you have 1, 2, and I believe you have 2 on the back, which you can't really see in that picture, unfortunately. But these obviously were pretty well big guns, as seems like the Soviets really like their big guns. Then again, we are just looking at light cruisers, so there are probably a hell of a lot larger guns, which we will see in the future in War Thunder. This machine could go, there we go, 33.5 knots on it, and on top of this, it also had different types of ammunition. So we're looking at a HE frag, semi-armor piercing, an AP round. So overall, we are looking at your generic rounds, which we see from every other light cruiser in the game right now. On top of this, you have some other stuff. So you have the SM-5 100mm dual-purpose guns, dual-purpose in the sense that they will be designed to attack either the air or the sea, or even ground, I suppose. So these were in 4 sets of dual or components, so there would be sets of 2 each, and there was 4 of them. These could fire HE frag, and also something called IS-ZS 55, and also an armor-piercing round. Not exactly sure what IS is, maybe it's some kind of smoke shell, really not sure about that. So the next one is more AA guns, so these were the 37mm 14 sets of dual 37mm. So as you can see here, it's got 2 guns in this configuration, and just times that by 14 and put them all over your light cruiser. These fired HE frag. These would be designed for obviously AA support. And then the last one, of course, is the torpedoes. You had 2 sets of 5 torpedoes, which would be on in the center, I believe, of the machine. If I could actually have a look. I'm guessing they'll be around this area. Pretty much standard configuration when we see these light cruisers. For me, if you start getting stuff like the Atlanta class, then you have to think about, once again, like they did last time in update 1.85, where they add 1 cruiser per nation. You're going to have to also do that once again. So maybe this could come alongside the an Atlanta class light cruiser. That would be kind of nice to see. Now we're going a little bit smaller again. So we're back to Britain. This is the Insect gunboat. Now, the Insect gunboat here from Mercedes 4321 is a World War I vessel from the British. And the best way to describe it is, you know the Flower class and the ship before it, I can't remember its name. Kind of like that in a way. At least the armament is like that, but it is much lower to the water and isn't as pronounced in how large it is. So for me, when I look at this machine, look at the Insect class gunboat, you can definitely tell it's a World War I design, and there were a decent amount of them made, as you can see here, which have some wonderful names, such as Cockchafer, and with this said, many of them from World War I were upgraded throughout the years with general weaponry changes and also some other ones. So this would be like a rank 1, rank 2 machine that we see from the British, but I think it definitely has a place in the game. So, the original specifications of this were 2 6-inch Mark 6 guns, 2 12-pounder AA guns, and 6 Maxim machine guns. So we're not looking at something which is, covered in armaments, but there is a decent variety there, and would, as I said, work well in either rank 1 or 2. The reason why I'm hesitant about putting it at rank 1 is because the amount of crew it had. 54 to 65 men is quite a lot for rank 1, so therefore I would want this as a rank 2 machine. Now, there are some other ones. This is the Cockchafer, HMS Cockchafer, in 1915, and it didn't have gun shields on the 6-incher at the front, as you can see, which is something that a few machines actually in the naval tree for the British have. I wonder if they'll ever model in specific crew members in areas, because then not having a gun shield would obviously make a bit of difference. But for right now, since we're doing more of an average crew, a percentage crew in naval, it doesn't really matter. So post-World War I, the armaments would be updated for use in the Yangtze River, which all the Insect class were eventually sent to the interwar years, and the new armament was 2 6-inch inchers, one 3-incher AA gun, and then one 2-pounder pom-pom, and 8 Lewis guns, 4 on each beam. So we are, once again, slowly but surely increasing weaponry, therefore the increase in the BR would come. And we have a lovely picture of a Lewis gun mount, which is literally just on a piece of board somewhere. And this one I thought was really cool to have a look at. This is the HMS B. And the HMS B well, it shouldn't come to the game, but I thought it was kind of cool because this became the flagship of Yangtze's, the Admiral and his staff at the time. The Yangtze's flotillas, Admiral and staff, this was their flagship. And you can see, all the homes which are here. You can see, I believe it still has the gun on the front. But this is just, it obviously eliminated a lot of the guns on it. All the rear-mounted guns, which as you can see from this picture, and this one, there's a decent amount of them, but I just thought that would be really cool. Kind of as a gift vehicle, that would be lovely to see. So, also, you have the Ladybird and the Aphis. These had 6-inch Mark, 7 guns. These were replaced by 6-inch Mark 8 guns, which were longer, so should be better. And then, of course, by World War II, they received another update in their armament, and by the time Operation Husky was around, the Cockchafer and the Scarab both replaced their 2-pounder pom-poms with 8 20mm Oerlikons. So you can see that there's a lot of variety with these boats or ships. You could easily be able to put them into the game at different BRs, depending on what armaments they have. They're generally not very quick, but overall, I think they would fit very well, as I said, in rank 1 or 2 of the British. The Aphis also acquired an Oerlikon and 2 20mm Bredders, but of course, the Cockchafer has to have a little bit more firepower behind it. Boom, boom. The next article is the AH-1Q. Now, the AH-1Q is a modification of the pre-existing AH-1G, and the main thing that this modification does for the helicopter is make it so it can add tow missiles to it. Now, Iron Physic has decided that this should be a modification put into the game, and I agree with him. The main reason for this is because the AH-1G as a starter helicopter is the only one which doesn't have some form of actual ATGM or I suppose you'd call it. But it doesn't have any guided missiles. How about that? It doesn't have any player-guided missiles, where everything else, if we look at the starter vehicles, do. The Mi-4 for the Soviets, the French aircraft for the Germans, or the French helicopter for the Germans. It has SS-11s attached, whereas the AH-1G stands out as the only one which only has access to Hydras, and that's really about it. So the prototype, the YAH-1Q, they took 8 AH-1Gs, they added XM-26 telescopic sight units to it, and 2 sets of 4-pack tow launchers. You can see them right here. So the M56 launchers, they were fitted on the outboard pylons, and this meant on the inward parts, you could still mount even more stuff, so unguided rockets if you felt like it. So there's even more opportunities here for the pre-existing AH-1G. What you could do is you could make it so it can carry the ATGMs the tows, and also the Hydras. So you could take this 8.0 vehicle and easily raise it to 9.0 and add these modifications, just like, as I said, the Mi-4 has. On top of this, the idea of having it as a modification, I think, is a good one, just to keep it in line, as I said, with the other vehicles. The problem I have, though, it is a very strong modification, and as we've seen with other helicopters, the only real reason to fly them, especially in ground realistic, is if you have access to either tows or attackers or attackers, the Soviets equivalent. So overall, it would have to obviously have a BR increase, but having it as a modification, I think, would work pretty well. It would be nice to have some helicopters without guided missiles, to be honest, but I think those would have to be lower down. I think giving the AH-1G this, creating it into the AH-1Q, would mean that it should be, it should be added to the game just to bring it up to speed with the other vehicles that we have. The next one is from Binsy Boy, and the Binsy Boy, who I've seen a lot on the Discord. Haven't seen him recently unless he's changed his name, which he might have done. So he has written an article which is looking at the Eurocopter, the Tiger, or the Tigre. And this was a joint, not really experiment, but joint venture by the French and the Germans who wanted to create a new helicopter. Basically, during the Cold War, they wanted to create an anti-tank helicopter just in case if the Soviets came across the Fulda Gap and decided that Western Europe was looking quite tasty. Instead, what they ended up creating after the Soviet collapse, or maybe during the Soviet collapse, was this Tiger, and instead of just being an anti-tank helicopter, it became a multi-role attack helicopter, and eventually, after a very long time, in 2008, it hit operational readiness, which is kind of insane when you think about the development period. But over this time, there was obviously a ton of improvements which were added to it, and also Australia have a version of it, and so do Spain. So you could technically add it, if you want to really be technical about it, to the French, the Germans. You could also add it to the British if you felt like it. And also, you could chuck it at somebody else, maybe. If you want to make a holistic idea about the EU being one Europe, you could add it to Italy as well. But yeah, it's one of those things. Overall, what we're getting out of this machine is a very modern helicopter, and with the addition of stuff like the AH-1Z, which is an incredibly modern helicopter on the same standards as the Eurocopter or the Airbus, this could easily be put into the game under the same criteria as it. Now, one of the issues, as Binsy Boy actually points out here, is that it has some insane actual additional armaments. So let's go through it. So it can either have on its inner hard points, so it's got two sets of hard points. It's got the inner ones and the outer ones, which effectively create 4 hard points. So the inner ones, the inner two, they can either carry 20mm autocannon pods, 22 68mm SNEB unguided rockets, 19 Hydras, 4 AGM Hellfires, 4 Spikes, 4 PARs, 4 Hot 3 missiles, and then on the outer hard points, you're looking at 2 Mistral air-to-air ones, 2 FIM 92 Stinger air-to-air ones, 12 68mm SNEBs, or 7 70mm Hydras. So you've got a mix of air-to-ground missiles, you've got a mix of air-to-air missiles, and you even have some actual just guns in there in the form of the autocannons. So overall, you've got a decent amount of stuff. On top of this, it has a main weapon. It has a chin-mounted 30mm. It's called the Giat 30. I'm not sure if it's Giat or Giat, but it also has this 30mm. So this thing is armed to the teeth, very much similar to the AH-1Z that we have in the game and the Mi-35M. So it would fit very pretty on top of the French or German tech trees. And since the Germans right now, I believe, don't have a 10-0 helicopter, this could easily be sad there. Now, there is a few caveats, though, as Binsy actually puts in this article, which are worth looking at. The armor on this is not your typical set of armor if we compare it to the other helicopters that we have in the game. This armor is composite armor, and the problem with this is it is seen to be effective against up to 23mm 23mm caliber rounds. So 23mm guns. Now, generally, if you actually look at the guns people are firing at helicopters at the moment, it doesn't really matter. They're generally bigger than 23mm, but it does mean that 50 cals may struggle against this thing. But overall, as Binsy says, we could since some of this is still classified, we could just do what they've done with every other rank 6 ground vehicle and helicopter and just throw some ideas in there, change a few statistics, and make it balanced in that way. So for me, I think if we're looking for a top-tier French or German helicopter, this would be perfect to add in. It makes sense. It's something that everybody knows. It's something that everybody would like to work to, and it would be equal, if not better, than stuff like the H-1Z at the top of the American tree, which seems to be the predominant helicopter that we have right now. The last suggestion is the Ka-52. This is a quite unique style of helicopter, at least if we compare it to the others in War Thunder, and this is once again from Wolfpack, and you can see it has 2 sets of rotor blades on it, which I think is very, very cool. Now, how did this vehicle come about? Well, in the early 1980s, basically there were 2 designs which were going around, and the main idea of these designs is they were intended for reconnaissance and also to command of a group of attack helicopters. So these would be kind of the first ones in to support the attack helicopters, and on top of this be able to do reconnaissance of the area. Now, as what happens with a lot of Soviet projects, such as, or maybe even Russian projects at this point, I'm looking at you, Armata, it's nice to see that they've reduced the amounts that you're supposed to be produced, and also only made about 10% of what they're supposed to by 2020. I hope you can make 180 tanks in about a year. Good luck. God damn, it's funny. I love talking about the Armata. It's so fun. Maybe I'll have somebody on just to laugh at them while they try and tell me it's a good machine. Anyway, looking at the Ka-52, there was 2 projects going on at the same time in the early 80s and early 90s, into the 90s. So because of cutbacks, let's say, due to funding issues, they decided that to scrap the battle management system, which was supposed to be, as I said, the command of the group of attack helicopters, and go down the reconnaissance route, and also create kind of a multi-role once again helicopter, which is something we see nowadays as kind of the standard. You look at the Mi-35, the Eurocopter, even the H-1Z, even though it's more of an attack helicopter, there's still a little bit of utility to it. So overall, even the Apache, being a multi-role. So overall, with this Ka-52, they dropped the idea of the battlefield management, made it a multi-role, merged the 2 ideas, and even after all of those cutbacks, they only made 10 of them because they had no money. So it's a sad story for this machine, because obviously it's a really cool design. It's really interesting to have a look at, but overall, not too great. So the primary difference between the production Ka-52 and the Ka-50, which was more of the prototype design, is the electronics. So generally something that we won't really see as a difference in game. And in 2008, it would begin a state trial, and the first Delvar of 3 helicopters would be completed soon after. And in 2011, the Ka-52 would be finally accepted into service with the Russian Air Force. A year later, the Ka-52 would be modified with additional set of pylons, and this would increase the maximum payload to 2,800 kilos. So once again, they have only made 10 Ka-50s, and then the push on from that is the Ka-52 that you see here. And obviously they've expanded on the ideas of the Ka-50, but they're pretty much the same damn thing. So any information that we can find on the Ka-50 will be very similar to the Ka-52, apart from specific armament issues. But still there is a funding problem, which seems to be standard for the Russians since the 80s. But overall, they do exist. They are in service. Once again, because of the H-1Z entering service in 2010, we can now have a look at stuff from 2011 and so on. I'm not happy with it, but because of the way that helicopter development works, I mean, you have to make little, what would be the word? You have to make little compromises when it comes to this stuff, and that's basically what I'm doing with these. So anyway, the multi-role helicopter, the primary armament is a 30mm cannon. It could fire API, HET, HEI, and APDS, of all things. So the APDS, it could pen 45 millimeters at 100 meters, an angle of 60. So we're not talking about something which is, crazy, but it's still, you still got pretty decent, different types of ammunition there, obviously designed for taking out other helicopters and defending yourself against airplanes, which is something that will happen in game. The inner pylons, or innermost pylon, I should say, air-to-surface missiles, and obviously it says may not be applicable for production Ka-52s, so we're still going on the Ka-50 standards. Remember that the Ka-50, the only real difference is, as said, the electronic differences and also the additional pylons. So we're going on pretty much, the same machine. Maybe the pylon difference does make a difference. But anyway, air-to-surface missiles in the form of KH-125 MLs. Then you have some R-73 air-to-air missiles on a central pylon. And then you get some Attacker D air-to-ground anti-tank missiles, and then of course some other stuff as well. Here we go. Which is some more air-to-ground anti-tank missiles, 6 missiles per pylon, due to their fire-and-forget nature, not currently applicable to War Thunder. Oh, Sonny Jim, how times have changed. And then, of course, you have the Iglas, which are the air-to-air man-pads, which I believe have actually been spotted in the dev server files, mounted on the hardpoints of the Mi-35M. So maybe we see them soon. But overall, basically, once again, ATGMs or AGMs, then you have heat seekers, then you also have primary guns in the form of a cannon. Overall, the Ka-52 or the Ka-50, depending on what you wanted to put into the game, they both fit if we compare their weaponry to what we see from other nations at this moment in time. Should we be adding more to pre-existing nations who already have helicopters or focusing on others? Who knows? But this would be kind of a cool top-tier vehicle to have, just because of its design nature and the weapons loadout that it has. Overall, some very high-tier stuff in these suggestions. Obviously, the nature of helicopters are high-tier, but, we still have a battle barge, and we still have a very interesting design for a boat, or, let's just call it the Insect class gunboat to not annoy anyone, from the UK. Overall, some pretty cool suggestions. The only one I'm really interested in is this one, but all the others I think could easily fit in the game, and I'm sure, especially with the Eurocopter, we will see it soon. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.